So tonight we're going to talk about decrypting ancient calendars, and this is a pretty famous image of a Mesoamerican calendar, the Aztec calendar. You may remember a couple years ago there was a kind of a big to-do that the world was going to end on December 21st, 2012, according to the ancient predictions from the Mayan calendar. And so that led to a bunch of memes and cartoons, like, for example, I only had enough room to go up to 2012. Ha, that'll freak somebody out someday. And then the other guy talking to a poor Mayan, cheer up, pal, it's not the end of the world, since, of course, he knows it will be. In fact, though, despite the fact that that was widely reported, that it was the Mayans had predicted that the world was going to end, I mean, I guess we lived through it and we knew that it didn't end. At least in a physical sense, maybe metaphorically, we had a bunch of things happen. But in fact, actually, this report was based, as maybe you were aware, on a misunderstanding of the Mayan calendar. So the Maya people were just amazing astronomers, probably some of the best ancient civilizations that were astronomers, and they also were very precise in their different ways of reckoning time. So they had a number of different components to their calendar which allowed them to actually list off dates that got very, very long. And so one of the things you can kind of see here, this is a modern way of showing how the components of the different Mayan calendar play off against each other as the different cycles are going on, and as the different alignments come together. That is counting off different periods for the Mayans. We'll explain a little bit of it here, right? So there's this thing that scholars call the Tzolk'in, and another thing that is called the Hab. And essentially at the heart of the calendar is this kind of ceremonial time period of 260 days. It's a count cycle called the Tzolk'in. So this may seem very strange to us, which is to say, what's a 260-day period? We don't have anything that is going like that, that's sort of arbitrarily operating. We think of, for example, the solar year, which has some observable reality as the sun moves in apparently, or the Earth that's actually moving, but as the sun apparently moves in the sky, and as that affects here in the northern hemisphere climates and seasons, and so that changes. And so a year is a kind of a reasonable measurement of time. Likewise, a day, we have a pretty reasonable idea about why, if something changes every single day, and we can observe that, and so that's a pretty reasonable unit of time to be playing around with. And even with a month, although our months don't line up with the phases of the moon anymore here in the West, and we rarely pay much attention looking at the moon. We don't always see it anymore. We're kind of not paying attention to the outside the way people did in the past, but at least we can see what an idea of a moon is by a unit of time. But so picking up this idea of having a 260-day period that therefore doesn't really correspond to anything observable seems very strange, although we can kind of make it out and figure it out in our own system when we think of the week. Because in point of fact, the week doesn't correspond to anything. It's simply a 7-day count that we have in a cycle that is continuously ongoing, and we name each one of the days. And so likewise, the Mayans had a 260-day cycle where they had unique names for each one of those days, like we do, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but they have 260 of them. There's a pattern to how they work. Essentially, the pattern works is that there's 20 different names that they have that are cycling around attached to a 13-number cycle. And then those are also now pulling against, that's creating that 260-day cycle. That then is tracking against what they have as a Hab, which is a 365-day solar year, or similar to a solar year, not quite a solar year, which is made up of 18 20-day-long months. So what we would call months, but anyway, it's not really a month. And then at the end, there's 5 days to get to the end of the solar year. So it's an intercalendary month is what it's called. It's these extra days to kind of catch it up. And so when that 260-day kind of cycle is now going against that 365-day period, that's creating what a bigger cycle. So essentially every 18,980 days, that those two cycles of Hobbes and Tzolkin's line up. So essentially, after 52 solar years, that'll have the same number of days, 18,980, that will take place in 73 of these 260-day periods. And so essentially there are, within then the Mayan calendar, 18,980 days, or a 52-year period of time where each day it would be able to be uniquely figured out by simply writing those two dates next to each other, the 260-day name and the 365-day name, right? And so anyway, the problem for them is then if they want to measure that any further, so that's about a lifetime. If for an ancient person, maybe 52 years. If you want to then get to a longer count unit of measurement, they have what is called a long count system. And the long count is listing all of these kind of numbers together, not decimally. For us, we put place order with zeros and everything like that when we're doing everything base 10, so that there's the ones, the tens, the hundreds, the thousands, or whatever for each of these. So for the Mayans and their long count, it's kind of a modified base 20 system starting with days, although that's a decimal digit. Then there is the winals, which are units of 20 days. So that would mean then if you have a date which is 00017, that equals 27, right? And so the same thing here, 0030, that's 3 winals, which would mean 60, right? And so then the next column, again, this is modified, so it's not exactly base 20. The next column here are tons, which are 360s instead of 400s, and you can imagine in a 360 kind of solar calendar kind of way, that's a useful unit. And so if you have a number like 00105, that would be 365 days, right? So anyway, you can kind of see they're having a long count. These are getting much bigger here, though, when we're getting to the Katuns and Baktuns. And so the Maya, in order to get back to the year 1 of their long count, they retrojected that back into their mythic past, and that corresponds, if we were to try to get their Gregorian calendar, to our calendar in the West here, to go back to it, to August 11th, 3114 BC. And so that's the beginning, and that's when they started. And so then, to go forward, if you get to the year 130000, that corresponds to this December 21st, 2012, the end of the world figure that we kept on hearing about. So what's happened here in the Mayan calendar, contrary to the reporting, is not that the world is predicting to end, but it just flips over just like we did with the year 2000, right? So we'd had all these times where we're in the 90s. We'd been in that whole millennia, for a whole 1,000 years, and technically the millennia still has one more year left at the end of it. But in any event, in the numbers, they flip over when we get there. And so what has really happened here as of 2012 in the Mayan calendar is it has been the dawning of the 14th Baktun, so that's where we are. And the reason why people said that as a prediction of the end of the world is the Mayan mythology is that there have been worlds before, and the worlds before were created and destroyed, and the last world before ours was only lasted 13 Baktuns. And so then the idea would be, well, maybe this world will only last 13 Baktuns. But they never said that anywhere in the Mayan stuff. So there's no particular reason for that. So anyway, this is a sample of what we're going to be doing tonight in terms of deciphering ancient calendars. Does it kind of make sense how this is fitting together with how the Mayan calendar works? It's complicated and crazy and weird, right? Okay. So we were just in Ravenna last month in Italy, in the last capital of the Western Roman Empire, and in the cathedral there is this amazing 6th century calendar that is preserved, that was a use as a calculator for allowing Christians in the 6th century to figure out what the date of Easter is. And they could use this, all of this table and everything like that, to figure out what day Easter will fall on every year between the year 532 and the year 626. So this calculator is no longer useful, although they still have it, because it's pretty cool. But anyway, you can kind of see how it goes. And in this case, I haven't been able to go through the whole thing and deciphering it. It's actually doing this kind of epigraphy is rather hard because you can kind of see everything is super abbreviated. So in ancient and medieval Latin, when people write this line over top of things, that's just indicating just abbreviations. And so they're very much abbreviating all the way through this in order to how to make this all work. And anyway, this is a part of the Easter computus. But we do want to go, I'm not going to be able to go through exactly this calendar, but I want to show you a little bit about the issue and why this was complicated. So what is Easter? For people who aren't aware. So this has been the celebration of the resurrection of Christ as understood by early Christians. And so it's been for 2,000 years among the most important holidays of Christianity. So we call it Easter in English. In Latin and Greek, it's called Pascha. And so for our word, Easter, the Venerable Bede, who's this very important monk in the early Middle Ages in Northumbria in England, he said that the English word actually is derived from the Anglo-Saxon goddess Aostra, who gave her name to Aostra month, which was one of the months of the Anglo-Saxon calendar. And Bede says that corresponds to our month, which we call Paschal month. But anyway, that's for Bede, not for us. Anyway, so in the Anglo-Saxon calendar. So that's Pascha or Easter. Yes, Shaheen.
Do you know what Aostra was a goddess of?
So Leandro may know a little bit. I mean, Aostra, though, is not... so unfortunately, with almost all of the Anglo-Saxon mythology, we have precious little of any of it. And so one of the things that... and so this is one that I think we don't know too well. I don't know, I can't remember offhand, but I do know that generally speaking, the way we kind of figure out what the different Anglo-Saxon ideas are is by taking their kind of correspondences in Norse mythology. But it's actually probably fairly different, and the Norse mythology is continually developing. So I don't remember, but I just kind of bring it up because a lot of times people will make the claim that the name Easter comes from Ishtar, and it's just not the case. That's not where that name is coming from. So when is Easter? Okay, Easter is a movable feast, which means that it moves against the calendar. So if you think of some holidays like Christmas, those are always on December 25th. Some holidays are move around based on the fact that, let's say, they're the third Monday of the month or something like that. But Easter moves around and is not, for example, like whatever the third Wednesday of a particular month or anything like that. Rather, Easter, the day, is the first Sunday that occurs after the ecclesiastical full moon, which is to say a period of time on the Gregorian lunar calendar, not the solar calendar. We don't pay much attention to this lunar calendar that we otherwise don't use. And it's the first, therefore, Sunday that follows the ecclesiastical full moon that follows March 21st, which is very complicated why that should be, right? So let's look at what all that is to unpack it. So we have in our calendar, one of the things we've inherited is a solar year. In the Gregorian calendar, it's either 365 or 366 days long, depending on if there's a leap year, right? So we normally have a 365-day year, but then sometimes we add an extra day at the end of February, and that makes it longer. So generally speaking, every 4 years, although we had some of the exceptions that occur on the century and millennial marks. Okay, so March 21st in this calendar is the fixed date for the vernal equinox. But it doesn't mean necessarily that that's when the actual astronomical vernal equinox is. So it's actually, the March 21st date is the date that's fixed in our Gregorian calendar as opposed to, let's say, the real solar year or the real equinox. Likewise, then, there is a lunar month, which is in the ecclesiastical calendar here, the Christian calendar. Those lunar months, like the actual lunar month, are 28 or 29 days long, depending. And essentially the full moon occurs on the 14th day of the lunar month. So the lunar month starts with a new moon, so when the moon is gone, the new moon is where the moon is full blacked out, And then by the middle of that month is when the full moon is, and that's the 14th day. And then we mentioned we have a week where we are doing like the Mayans, who are counting this 260-day cycle where they just continually repeat the cycle. Every day we count a 7-day cycle and we just repeat that cycle. And so Sunday is the name we give to the first of those 7 days, right? So that's the three and how they all line up. And so when we are going to say, like, when is Easter? The earliest time you can ever have Easter occurred in the year 1818. And so it just so happened on the Gregorian calendar, our modern Western calendar, in the year 1818, March 21st, which is to say the ecclesiastical date for the vernal equinox, that day corresponded with the 14th day of the ecclesiastical lunar calendar, which is to say when that lunar calendar is having its full moon. So it may not be an actual full moon and it may not be the actual vernal equinox, but it's when the calendar is calling for those two things. And so then that actually also happened to fall on a Saturday, which is important for, because the 7-day count is also happening, right? So all of those things lined up in 1818, and that meant then on March 22nd, it was after the full moon, and so, but it's only one day after. It could have been, just because this is the shortest possible. And then that also, because it's a Sunday, comes right after a Saturday, it turns out then that March 22nd, is when Easter was in the year 1818. So that's the earliest possible date Easter can fall, the way this all works. So the next time that's going to happen is on March 22nd, 2285. So it's kind of a rare to have all these things line up. So that's a period of 467 years in this particular instance. Okay, so that's the earliest kind of Easter. The latest kind of Easter you can have occurred most recently in the year 1943. So in that year, the full moon of the ecclesiastical lunar calendar happened the day right before March 21st, so it happened on March 20th, and so therefore it can't count. And so then you got to get all the way into the middle of the next one before you have your first full moon, and that occurred then on April 18th. And since that April 18th happened to correspond with a Sunday, it couldn't be Easter, so you have to wait another whole 7 days to the next Sunday. And so when that happened, then the Easter then occurred on April 25th, and so that's the latest that Easter can happen. And so April 25th, 1943, the next time that'll happen is actually April 25th, it should say, not March 22nd. The next time it'll happen is April 25th, 2038. So it's happening about, in this case, only a century apart. Is that clear? Yeah, go ahead.
Who came up with this idea? When was this first time celebrated?
Yeah. Who came up with this crazy idea, right? It's in the Bible, right? They must say this in the Bible. No, it's not in the Bible. So yeah, we'll figure it out. That's where we're going to go next. So, because it is a crazy thing. Okay, so just because I've been talking to you about, I've been using here the Gregorian calendar, which is to say the Western calendar. You can imagine here with these kind of Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Easter eggs, it's not going to be the same day, right? Because the Eastern churches never adopted the Gregorian calendars for Pope Gregory. They don't recognize the Pope. The Protestants all eventually recognize the Gregorian calendar, although they didn't recognize the Pope either. Anyway, so as a result of that, the Eastern Orthodox calendar, they're still on the Julian calendar, the one that's named for Julius Caesar. And so the Eastern Orthodox calendar is 13 days off from the Gregorian calendar, from all the rest of our calendars. But you can imagine, since they're using the same calculus for Easter, it doesn't mean that Eastern Orthodox Easter is 13 days apart from Western Easter, right? Because it's Christmas. Eastern Orthodox Christmas is that many days apart. But the problem with this is the calculation goes in the same, so it can never be 13 days apart. They can only be multiples of 7 days, right? Because it's always going to be on a Sunday. So they put the same formula in, but they get a different result as a result of having the Julian calendar. Okay, so this seems like it's very arcane already, but I think that this is going to end up being, I think, a kind of an interesting thing. So this was crucially important, if you can imagine. It seems incredibly arcane, and we maybe don't know it. How do we find out when Easter is? I type into Google, when is Easter in 2020, and Google tells me when it's going to be, right? But back then, back in the past, of course, they didn't have Google. They had to do all of the math for themselves, and they had to figure out these things. There is this massively important synod in Northumbria in medieval or Dark Ages England in the year 664, where King Oswiu of Northumbria called together all of his prelates and everything like that, and they debated between all of the people from the Celtic Church, from the Irish, the Scottish, the Picts, and everybody like that, who had one way of calculating when Easter was, and then he talked to all of the people from the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had been converted from Rome, and so all the Romans and the Franks, and how the Pope did the calculation, and they debated, and what ended up happening is that King Oswiu decided, we're going to go with the Roman style. We're going to reject what the Celtic Church had. And so that has ended up being like a very major moment that pulled the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and everything like that into the orbit of Rome, and started creating the kind of a Rome-centered idea of the Western Latin Middle Ages. This is the ruins of the Abbey of Whitby. So why was it such a big deal? Why does it matter when the exact day of Easter was? Well, when we start to realize how the calendar used to work and used to be lived compared to how we live it now, it turns out that this doesn't affect only Easter for all of these people in medieval Christianity. So, of course, Easter isn't only all by itself. It comes at the end of a whole week of different celebrations that Christians have, kicking off here with Palm Sunday, and then all kinds of things, what's called Spy Wednesday, which is essentially when it's remembered that Judas, betrayed Jesus, that kind of a thing. Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Good Saturday, and finally Easter Sunday, right? But prior to Holy Week, you may be aware, there's this, right, including Holy Week, up to and including the last week here, Holy Week, there are 40 days of Lent, which is this period of time when Christians are doing different kinds of fasting, but also, still to this day, people give stuff up, right? So everybody gives up chocolate or something like that for Lent. And so it's a time period where you make some kind of a sacrifice for 40 days. Well, the calculation of when those 40 days are, it means 40 days before Easter. So that whole period of time also moves around just like Easter, and that gets kicked off with the holiday of Ash Wednesday, where you may be aware of people putting ashes on their foreheads and things like that. We may also be aware that before Ash Wednesday is the last day before Lent, and which is to say Fat Tuesday, Mardi Gras. So Mardi Gras, when Mardi Gras happens, is also dependent on when Easter is going to happen, right? So it's not the same day every year. It's 41 days before Easter Sunday. So as a result of that, Western Mardi Gras, next year is going to be on February 25th, but Greek Orthodox, I'm sure they have a very fun Mardi Gras in the Greek Orthodox Church. That's going to take place on March 3rd, as a result of those two different calendars and calculations. Okay, so we have that whole thing in that direction. It also turns out then 50 days after Easter Sunday is Pentecost. So you can imagine this entire component of the Christian year is totally dependent on when Easter happens to be. And so if you're in this place like Oswiu and Oswiu's wife, Queen Einfleth, if you were like them, she's celebrating according to the Roman system. He who had been raised in exile up in this area that later becomes Scotland, he is doing the Celtic. You can imagine that the courts aren't even in sync. And so all the different times when you're supposed to be doing all this Lenten stuff, she's celebrating Easter already, and you can imagine that would have been very, very complicated considering this calendar is regulating everything about life, especially in that time period. And so making that change was a pretty big deal when they decided, okay, no, we're going to go with the Roman system. So, okay, so this is your question. Why is Easter the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox? And I'm putting those stars there because that means according to the calendar, right? Not according to the astronomical unit, the lunar date, the actual lunar full moon, or the actual vernal equinox. And so we have those criteria, that March 21st, the full moon, the Sunday. Why? Well, the Sunday makes sense, right? So why on Sunday? So the idea of this holiday is that it's a commemoration of the resurrection of Jesus, which that goes all the way back to the first century, the canonical Gospels. People have the idea that that the resurrection occurs on Sunday, and that becomes the Lord's Day, and that becomes then the central celebration of the day of the week in the Christian tradition. So before, in the Jewish tradition, the observance of the seventh day is on the seventh day of the week, the Sabbath, and the Christians switch it from the Sabbath to the first day of the week, the Lord's Day. So Sunday makes sense, but what about this first full moon after the vernal equinox? And so the answer to that is Passover, as we might imagine. So we already mentioned that in the other languages, in Latin and Greek and other related languages, that the word for Easter is actually Pascha or Pascha, and that's connected with the Jewish Passover, which in Hebrew is Pesach, or in Aramaic is something like Pascha, just like in Latin and Greek. So initially it's that. So the Hebrew calendar then, now that's opened up, where do we get to that? So in the Hebrew calendar, the month of Nisan is the first month of the Hebrew calendar. It begins at the vernal equinox. So that's where you can kind of see the vernal equinox coming into it. Months in the Hebrew calendar are 29 or 30 days long, depending, which that is, of course, the approximate of what an actual lunar month is. And they begin at the new moon. So again, at that time period, at the new moon, just like the ecclesiastical lunar month that I was mentioning. So Passover begins on the 15th of Nisan, and that means to say, once we get through that lunar cycle, that's going to be about 29 or 30 days long. The 15th is going to be when you're at the full moon, right? And so now you can see kind of even in how the Hebrew calendar, we're getting to the first full moon after the vernal equinox, right? So for the Christians in the first few centuries, they likely just celebrated Easter on the Sunday after Passover. So they would just use the Hebrew calendar and just calculate it that way. But as was happened with so many things at the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, when Christianity really started getting its act together, it became the main religion of the Roman Empire and had the patronage of the Emperor Constantine. They started making all kinds of different rules, and one of the decisions that was made is we are not going to be on the Hebrew calendar. That is not going to be, it's not going to be the Judeo-Christian calendar, it'll be only Jewish calendar. Instead, we are going to retain the calendar of the Roman Empire, and so our calculation is going to be based on how are we doing stuff in the using the Roman calendar, and that's what we have coming down to this day, where the calendar that we use in the West, the Gregorian calendar, is almost exactly the same as the Julian calendar, the calendar that Julius Caesar reformed during his leading of the Roman Republic. Okay. So, what time is it? I think I might have even got this right, as I'm estimating. It's 2019, right? And it's 2019 AD, or Anno Domini, which in Latin, that means the year of our Lord. And so that is dating then 2019 years from the traditional birthday of Jesus, supposedly 25 December in the year -1, in the year 1 BC. Jesus is definitely not born then at all. That's just entirely traditional. There's nothing tying Jesus to the 25th at all. That's a later tradition. And likewise, the AD date is certainly wrong. So anyway, that's what we count to in the present. It's October. So this month's name comes from the Latin word for 8, octo. And that is true despite the fact that this has been the 10th month of the year ever since the time of Julius Caesar. So even though we call this in Latin, it's called 8th month, it's actually 10th month, as we maybe know when we write out the abbreviation for October. So other months that we've inherited in our 12-month calendar are named for people like Julius Caesar, so the month of July. August is named for his successor, Augustus. They're also named for Roman gods like Mars, which is March is named for, but there's also Greek gods that have made it in, like the goddess Maya, who is the oldest of the Pleiades, the sisters who make up the stars of the Pleiades. The day is Tuesday. That's named for another one of these Anglo-Saxon gods about which we don't know that much, but Tiw. And so he's related to the Norse god Tyr, that we know a little bit more about, who's a god then of law and heroism in the Romance tongues. So if you may know the French and the French name for the days, they don't name them after Anglo-Saxon gods, as you could imagine. And instead, the day will be called something like Mardi, so like Mardi Gras, so that means Fat Tuesday. And so it, again, in that case, is named for Mars. And so Tyr, as far as the Romans were concerned, corresponds to Mars, right? And so the same way that Woden's Day, Wednesday, corresponds to Jovedi, right? Or is it, which is it? Thor's Day. No, Wednesday.
Mercury.
Mercoledi? No, that's Monday. Wait, no, that's Lunity. I'm trying to think. Oh, it is.
It's Mercury.
How interesting.
Jupiter and Venus.
Right, and so Venus works because Freya and Venus, but it's because you can already see here how the gods, by the time they get to the Norse configuration, they have changed, and so we don't actually have we have the gods lining up differently as a result of that. Anyway, the other days then are named for people like Freya. Frigga is the Anglo-Saxon version of Freya. Monday named for the moon, and because there wasn't a good correspondence, this Saturday they kept the Roman name, so the Roman god Saturn for our days. It's 8:10, I didn't quite make it. So it's a little bit after 8 of the clock, PM, post-meridian, which means to say past midday, which if we use military time is 19, that should be 20, wait, what is it, 1805, no, 2005. I didn't change my clock here. So anyway, 2005. So mechanical clocks that we are so use and are so ubiquitous in our life, or actually obviously digital now, came into being around the year 1300. So they didn't have this kind of time reckoning before the Middle Ages. So we have inherited then a whole bunch of units of time in our system. So we have seconds and minutes and hours and days and weeks. We don't really use fortnights, but sometimes people remember fortnights, months, seasons, years, decades, centuries, millennia, and so these are cycling kind of on the weird numbers, 60 per minute, 60 per hour, 24, 7, 12, anyway. So these are more decimal at this point. But anyway, you can see the system is kind of a bunch of amalgam of strange inheritance, really. So months are an irregular number of days. So we have 12 months per year, but the months don't correspond to any, they're not just 29 or 30 days long, or, they're any number between, most are 30 or 31, but then February is either 28 or 29. Likewise, the given years vary in the number of days, depending on, so it's either going to be 365 or 366, depending. Weeks don't align with years at all, so you don't get to the end of the year and it's always going to be a Sunday or something like that. Those are just completely not. That cycle is not having anything to do with each other. We don't care so much because our phone tells us what time it is, all the time, and so that's the easiest way. And in fact, it updates daylight savings time. Thank heavens, because otherwise we never remember that. Never used to anyway. However, the reality is that before it was measured by actual observation as opposed to us observing our phones. And so the way people looked at things in the past was through the observable time. So we have things like, as we mentioned, the solar day. And the solar day is, as we observe the sunrise and the sunset, then there's you can't see the sun, it's nighttime, and then the sun is going to rise again. And it doesn't necessarily start at the beginning of sunrise. It can start at different times depending on how you want to do it, but this is the period that is completely, it's just a natural thing that we observe happening. When you decide to start it is kind of the human arbitrary decision. So a lot of times we think of the day our day starts at midnight, right, in the middle of the night. The Jewish or Hebrew calendar date starts at sunset, right? So the beginning of the nighttime period at the sunset, and then goes until the sunset the next day. Other people's calendars, they understand it when the sun rises. That's the beginning of the day. Anyway, that's a solar day. This is obviously set at equinox, when the night and day are equal durations. But obviously, when it's summer, the day light hours are longer and the nighttime hours are shorter. And it's the opposite here in the winter time after the equinox, where the days are shorter. And that was something I remember where I took, my parents gave me like an IQ test when I was 6 or 7. And I remember the one question I remember them asking is, which is longer, days or nights? And I think I missed the question, because you know what I mean, you're a little kid. So anyway, but now I realize, wait a second, no, it's not always one way or the other, right? So natural hours, if you could imagine, if you're doing it based on a sundial, where you have essentially the hours that are marked off from 1 to 12, they would have varied in length, because obviously in the winter, the hours would be shorter in the same way that the daylight period of time is shorter. It'd still be 1/12 of daylight, but it would be a much shorter period of time than what we now have, where an hour is precisely 1/24 of a day. Before mechanical clocks, there were very many irregular units that were used. So there were, for example, 5 points per hour, 10 minutae per hour, 40 momenti per hour, 480 ounces per hour, 12 ounces per momentum. So these are different Western measurements that people would talk about. But our current geometrically based 60 system is created in the Middle Ages by dividing hours into 60 minutae primi, which is to say 60 minutes. That's the Latin. And then 3,600 minutae secundae, so you can see why that became seconds. And then they also even had 216,000 minutae tertii. The tertiis have essentially fallen out. We don't use, we decimalize seconds at this point, I think, instead of using those. But they are in astronomical notations, if you'd use that, is dividing the circles. Okay. So when we were doing this kind of thing and we were looking at this idea of the day and night moving, that's another one of the things you can observe. So we starting at that period of time where there's that equal time, vernal equinox in the spring, and we have that period of time when the days are longer than the nights, then we have the autumnal equinox, then we have days shorter, and it goes back to the vernal equinox. So when we see that, that's when we have the solar year, sometimes called the tropical year. And so often that starts at the vernal equinox, but it doesn't always. But anyway, so we just mentioned, kind of does for example, in the Jewish calendar. We also have, observably, which we mentioned, here is the lunar month, or synodic month. And again, in this particular case, it's often started when we don't have a month, and then as the moon starts to appear and is waxing, going to its first quarter, ultimately full moon, and then starts waning and goes back to new. That's generally speaking 29 or 30 days, and so that's a period of time that people also observed and often used. So the problem, though, if we were going back to people in antiquity and they're trying to get a calendar going with all these things, none of these numbers match up, right? And so the day doesn't correspond to any one perfect set of lunar months. And also the day that doesn't correspond, there wasn't just one number of days that correspond to the solar year, right? So the actual solar year is 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 45 seconds. Likewise, the lunar month, the actual month, lasts 29 days, 12 hours, 43 minutes, 3 seconds. And so therefore and also in terms of not fitting together, the month and the year don't match up, because in fact the solar year lasts for 12.37 lunar months, right? And so you can imagine that's no fun. That doesn't work, and so that's a lot of math, and it's easy for us to do math, but it was much more complicated for ancient people to do math, especially if you can imagine, like you were working with things like Roman numerals, right? So it's a lot less fun. So the easiest calendar that people could come up with, and often did, is deciding, for example, well, we're going to make a month that is 30 days. It's just 11 hours too long to do that. And then you can make a year made up of 12 30-day months, but that's 5 days too short, right? And so you end up with, kind of your slapstick calendar that goes together and works a little while, but over time it will get off, right? So the problem with it is that slowly over time those 11 hours add up each month, and so at a certain point your months are no longer starting when it's a new moon. It's starting now at a certain point of time when it's already the new moon is a couple days into your month or something like that. Likewise, the year will also stop attaching. If you started it off with the vernal equinox, 5 days is a lot, right? So at 5 day intervals, your calendar's going to get off pretty fast. And so then at a certain point, you're planting the crops in December, and you're harvesting in July, and it's very confusing. That's not what you ever want to have happen. So the solution when you're doing that, the easiest way to work this up is called intercalation. And so what are the things that they would do? We do intercalation in our system because we have a leap day, right? So every 4 years we add an extra day into February, except for if it's at the century mark, and again we do it again at the millennial mark or whatever, in order to get to those little decimal increments, right? And so what they would do in many of these ancient calendars is that they would add days in order to get the months back online, or they would add whole months in order to get the years back into alignment. So leap days, is what our way of doing it, but the calendar, so one of the things that happens because we only do leap days and we don't do months is that, as we mentioned, our Gregorian months have no correspondence at all with the actual lunar month. So just because it's the first, let's say we're coming up to the 1st of November, we can't go outside and find out, it's also going to be a new moon, because that's always what happens at the beginning of the month. Our months are now totally unconnected to the actual lunar month. And so you have to look it up on your phone when the full moon is going to happen, and it can happen on any day of the month, right? So where does this all stuff come from? Where did people all have this? Well, as with so many things in our inheritance, and you go back in Western civilization, things start out with the Sumerians, and this is also true for a lot of our calendrical inheritance. So there is a stela that has a bunch of writing called the Calendar of Shulgi, which is one of these Sumerian city-states. And that's just the one that we have the evidence for, but it goes all the way to the 21st century BC. So that's as far back into the BC as we are into the AD. The Sumerians already have what we'll call as a lunar solar calendar that has 12 months that are based on the actual lunar month. And then they will add, in order to keep that calendar aligned, they will occasionally add an intercalary month. So essentially the month is getting off, and then they have to add an extra month. And so their calendar here, the Sumerian calendar, became the basis for the Babylonian, the Assyrian, the Persian, and ultimately the Hebrew calendars. So there's still a lot of it with us. So we talked here about the observable year. So even though the year is its own real obvious thing, so it's affecting the seasons, we can watch the sun track and everything like that and have it happen. When the year starts is just an arbitrary thing on our part. We could decide it any time we wanted to. As we mentioned here, the Sumerians are starting it in the spring, and so they think of spring as a time of new and renewal. But the Chinese calendar, for example, starts it just barely after the winter solstice. So they are seeing the renewing happen when the days are starting to get longer, and that's why Chinese New Year comes similarly to our Western New Year now, right? So likewise, we also mentioned when should the month start. So this particular calendar, the ancient Sumerian one, is starting with the new moon, but it doesn't have to. You could always say the full moon is when the month has really gotten here and is starting. Okay, so if we look at the Babylonian calendar, it works kind of the same way, having those same things, dividing those 360 days up into 29 or 30 day lunar months. These are the names of the Babylonian months, and then there's a 13th month that they have to add every once in a while to keep the phases of the moon in line with their months. And because of doesn't work again in terms of the 365-day solar year and the 29, 30-day lunar month. So one of the things, though, that's kind of interesting is that these months correspond exactly to our signs of the zodiac, and that's no coincidence at all. So you may wonder why, why wouldn't it be that just everybody born in April is in Aries, and instead it's this strange thing where it goes from late March to early April and so on. So in other words, where the dates of all of these astrological signs don't correspond to our Western calendar. And the answer is that they correspond to the Babylonian calendar, because the Babylonians and essentially the zodiac and this kind of astrological stuff kind of is all finding its origins with those guys as opposed to with the Romans. And it's Westerners who kind of imported their ideas of astrology and astronomy that put those all together. Interestingly then, also, the Hebrew calendar has the exact correspondences, and even including the kind of names which derive from the Babylonian names. So we mentioned here that the first month in the Hebrew calendar is Nisan. Well, this is taking its name from the Babylonian name Ara Nisanu, and you can see here, Ara Tamuzu is Tammuz, and there's just a bunch of coordinate, these all kind of coordinate because essentially during the Babylonian captivity and all the times period when the Judeans and the ancient Jews are essentially part of the Persian Empire, they adopt all kinds of things, including the language, Aramaic, and also all of these kind of customs up to and including the calendar. And so that also maintains itself. And that's one of the reasons why in the very earliest synagogues that we have, it's quite common for a decoration to be of the zodiac, right? So you can kind of see here in this very early, I think it's maybe 2nd century AD synagogue, and there's things like Pisces, here, and Cancer, you can see all the signs of the zodiac, right? Leo. These are all in Hebrew, so you'd have to read that way. Gemini. And so the reason for that, you think, wait a second, why would there be these essentially pagan gods, as the decorative motifs on the floor of a synagogue? You'd think that wouldn't be allowed because of the prohibition of making graven images and having pagan gods and things like that in terms of worship. And it's because of the significance of the calendar here. And so these are symbols that are simply representing the calendar for ancient Jews. Okay. So we talked about this being a lunar solar calendar, and so we want to explain a little bit how this works so that we can get it how it goes. So the Hebrew lunar year, and this is true for, again, the Babylonians and everybody before, is 11 days shorter than the solar year and uses a 19-year-long cycle that's called the Metonic cycle to keep the lunar and solar years aligned. So what ended up happening in the year 432, there's this guy, ancient Greek astronomer called Meton of Athens, and the guy is almost certainly probably just reading this from Babylonian sources that we don't have. So many times the Greeks got access to Babylonian and Persian stuff and then just took credit for it, and this is one of those occasions. So he observed that the solar and lunar cycles almost perfectly align every 19 years. So 19 solar years equals 235 lunar months. So if you take the actual period of a lunar month and you add 235 of those up, and then you take 19 solar years, they add up to within just a couple hours of each other in terms of the length. And so this cycle is really important. It's like that cycle that we've talked about that occurs every 52 years with the Mayans, right, where they're getting their solar year to align up with their 260-day period of time. So now here's the time when months and years line up, and it's every 19 years. And that's an observable phenomenon, and again, the Babylonians observed that, and so did this ancient Greek guy. And so what they end up doing in order to make their calendar work is that they define the year as being 1/19th of a 19-year Metonic cycle, right? So the year is that long, and so that gives that there's a that 19-year cycle is 6,940 days. And so then that means the year is 365 and a quarter and 176 long, which is really quite good in terms of the measurement. And so that means then that there is, what does it mean? Which is, that length of the year is 11 days more than 12 synodic months. So the lunar month, it doesn't work to that, but in 19 years it does. So in order to keep the lunar month aligned to this calendar, that means that they added a 13th month to the year every 2 or 3 years, for a total of essentially doing that 7 months in a period of 19, right? So the 19-year cycle is going to add up to the right number of months that you have, and that's going to be 7 more than doing 12 a year. And so anyway, this is a lot of math, and I'm not the math person, but you can just kind of see how that works. So there's 19 years that are 12 months long, and you add in 7 more months in the whole course of those 19 years, and that gives you a 235 month period, which is that 19-year period. And so that keeps the calendar over the course of 19 years aligned so that it always starts on the vernal equinox, and aligned so that the first day of the month is always the new moon, right? It gets off a little bit, but it fixes itself over the course of a 19-year period. Okay. Because this is such a cool thing that works, lots of people figured it out, and that's also true that the ancient Chinese people also figured it out, and that's why when we kind of look at Chinese astrology, we say, well, there's a lot of things that correspond here in terms of them having a 12-sign kind of zodiac-like thing. And part of it is, again, because they also make use of this lunar solar calendar with the Metonic cycle. So over the course of 19 years, the Chinese calendar, historically the traditional calendar, also intercalinates by adding these extra months, and it works kind of therefore like the Jewish calendar, Hebrew calendar. As we mentioned, the Chinese calendar, though, begins at the first new moon following the winter solstice, which is why Chinese New Year is kind of when our New Year is, as opposed to the Jewish New Year. What about the Islamic calendar? So in Greece, Babylon, and China, Rome, everywhere, anytime you have one of these intercalendary months, so anytime you're getting to the place, you can imagine people in antiquity, they like things that are normal. Suddenly you get to this time period when they're like, okay, we got to add another month. That doesn't seem anything. It doesn't seem normal. It seems kind of scary. in a lot of the systems before, they have a fixed system and it happens automatically, like it happens now in the Jewish calendar. A lot of times it would require the priests to make some observations, to deliberate and decide, okay, we need to add a month. And that was certainly how it worked in ancient Rome, where the Roman priests, the civic magistrates and the censors would have to decide, okay, it's now time to add intercalendary months so that we can get the calendar fixed again. And that was certainly one of the things that Julius Caesar was called upon to do when he fixed the calendar and made it into what had been a calendar that required fixing all the time, and then made one that didn't require fixing until the 1700s, right? And so that same thing that happened when people would get very freaked out or nervous, this is also true for the Mayans, when they get to that intercalendary month, the Prophet Muhammad seems to have prohibited what's called nasi, which may indicate intercalation. And so, especially though it says in Quran that God has ordained that there's going to only be 12 months. The 12 months is the number. And then in other instructions elsewhere, the idea is that there's a criticism that the polytheists, that the Persians and the Christians have been adding months. So the Persian calendar will add a month, and that is viewed then as impious. And so the result of that is the Islamic calendar is not lunar solar, it is purely lunar. And so it continues to follow that 12-month cycle, but as a result of that, it is only 354 or 355 days long, depending on how long the months are. And so, as you can imagine, that's why the Islamic calendar fairly quickly moves on against the solar calendar, because it's 10 days off. And so you wonder why does Ramadan always feel like it's on some kind of crazy time of the year? It seems like it could be any time of the year, because it moves pretty fast, actually, against the solar year. So that prohibition came in the year 10 Anno Hegira, which is to say, and this is the Islamic, the Latin for the H is the Latin for the Islamic dating system, which is the time of the exile to Mecca, to Medina. Okay, so the Roman calendar, this is actually a pretty neat thing that we have where we have kind of like a Roman calendar. I think this is a reconstruction. Also began with intercalenation that nobody liked. So in the most archaic Roman form that we kind of have it, it made sense that October was 8th month. You know, we actually had months that were quintilis, sextilis, September, October, November, December, which is to say 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Because the first months here were Martius, Aprilis, Maius, Junius, and then again 5, 6, 7, 8. So there were only those then 10 month, and then there was just this unmarked winter period that was just consisting of intercalendary days. And you can imagine it's not a very effective calendar, but it's one that where the priests would have a certain amount of control as they're deciding went through their observations about when we're going to stop having an intercalendary day and we're going to get into more normal time. That's in the very archaic times. By the time of the Roman Republic, when it's kind of entering into history, there have already been some additions. So we already have January and February, which have been added and therefore making the numbered months not work anymore, right? And so as a result of that, what the intercalation takes place in February, and so this month could go, any number of days depending on what the Roman censors decided to add to it. And so then over time, Quintilis got renamed Julius or July, Sextilis got renamed Augustus, and so ultimately it was fixed by Julius Caesar, and so we have February with the leap day in order to fix these alignments. But when that happened, then that sacrifices the lunar alignment, right? So at that point, we're no longer intercalating in order to make it so that we can line up the months. And so our months haven't lined up ever since Julius Caesar's day. Okay. So we have the solar year, we have a fixed month in our calendar, and we have our weeks. So let's look at the weeks. So the 7-day week, and I now see I didn't have to memorize this because I wrote it down. So for what it is. Are named in our case here for, where are they? Named for Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So these are from the Anglo-Saxon names, Sunandag, Munandag, Tuesdag, Wednesdag, that's Thursdag, and so forth, right? And so those are then named for the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn in the Romance countries, but in ours, Tiwaz, Wodenaz, Thunraz, and Frigga, or rather, as we know them in Norse, Tyr, Odin, Thor, and Freya, right? And so they didn't have a Norse god for that, so we kept Saturn. Anyway, so as we see, Mercury doesn't really line up with who we think of Odin as being more like Jupiter, but here Thor is lining up with Jupiter. And so probably what's happened for the Norse gods is that Odin has taken on a much bigger role by the time we get to the Middle Ages, when the Norse mythology is being worked out, as compared to what it was for the Anglo-Saxons in the 5th and 6th centuries. So we might remember also that the 7 days, where are we getting 7 days?
There's a question, John.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I'm sort of surprised that the names of these pagan gods were retained by Europeans well into Christian civilization.
Right.
Would that have been considered pagan? And weren't they trying to get rid of as much pagan stuff as possible?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's pretty interesting, right? So we have this impression that Christianity did this, completely did this like massive thing where it displaced, and that somehow the Christian Roman Empire is this complete sea change from what went before as the pagan Roman Empire. And I think that this is just there's so many different ways that we can look in if we just look under the hood just slightly, that we see that this is just not the case. That there's so much more continuity than there is change. And so there's so many things like this that are just surprisingly survive. So they didn't go through and, even if we go to the next slide, all of the planets here are still Jupiter and all those things. They didn't go through and say, okay, well, we're going to call that St. Mary now, or something like that. So that in theory they could have gone through and done that, and we could have had all of the days, been at the minimum just changed to 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, or something like that. But it's surprising that in fact, actually, all of the pagan gods survive. They continue to survive in the planets, the days of the week, the months. And it just shows how very, very difficult it is to get anybody to change any of these things. One of the things that they tried to do in the French Revolution. So the French Revolution successfully, almost everywhere except for here in North America, they successfully replaced all of the different units of measure with the metric system, right? And so and the reason for it is that everybody had their own different systems, and they were all complicated, and it was impossible to get anything done. So it was much easier to have one decimal-based system, and that has proved to be a wonderful benefit. But they tried to do the same thing with the calendar. And so they created all of these new months and decimal time and all this kind of thing, and it just didn't stick, And so it's very hard to do it. And so I don't even think that there's an example of the Christians even trying to go through and rename, let's say, the planets and start calling Jupiter, like I say, St. Mary, or St. Paul.
Even having 12 apostles, it would work well for the months.
Yeah, they have 12 apostles. They could have named them, except for we don't have a good list of who all the 12 apostles are, because it's kind of made up too at the end. But anyway, yeah, that could have worked. But no, it didn't happen. And so I think part of it is that actually so much of everything is exactly the same from before and after the Roman Empire is Christianized. So everything from the fact that all of the architecture stays the same, the basilica and everything like that is simply a Roman civic building that Christians repurpose. Likewise, the calendar, the sciences, the language, Latin, education system, they continue to read all of the pagan classics. That's how they learn Latin. Philosophy, the philosophy just gets a little veneer on it, and it's suddenly Christian theology, and that's true here too. So we have the planets, and so the planets you can see also correspond to, we have those weekdays, you can kind of see, again, sun. This is the ancient and medieval Ptolemaic system of how the universe works. So the Earth is here at the center, then the different circles, Moon, Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the fixed planets, the stars. And so in that same way, the weekdays are corresponding also with planet names, although the order is different. So that was already true back in antiquity, where Plutarch asked, why are the days named after the planets reckoned in a different order from the planet order? So it was already a mess as of the 1st century, and they wanted to figure out how to make it work. But anyway, it didn't work out. But that's kind of how it goes. So, as we mentioned then, we have this 7-day cycle that presses onward and onward. As we try to align it, the Babylonians divided their months into kind of quarter months, which corresponded then to that 7-day week. And the Babylonians are probably the people who originated the 7-day week. But their problem, of course, always was that the month isn't quite 28 days long. And so their solution here is intercalation. And so the Babylonian calendar used intercalation to keep the 7-day week lined up with the observable month. But all the later groups, Hebrew, Persian, Greek, Roman weeks, they were adopted without intercalation. And so that means that the 7-day week has not corresponded to the calendar for over 2,000 years. And so the 7-day week from the Babylonians was adopted by the Persians, and obviously then from them the Hellenistic Greeks. The Romans actually adopted it from the Greeks prior to the conversion to Christianity. A lot of times we might think, well, the 7-day week is really Jewish and became Christian, but in fact that path has also influenced it, but essentially the Romans had already adopted it, and that became part of the European calendar. Meanwhile, in India and China, there was also it also spread that way. So the 7-day week has had a big success story around the planet, and we sometimes say anyway that this this cycle, though, as we say, as it's been rolling on and on and on, so we can always say how it works. The relationship it has to the rest of our calendar, though, is none at all. So it doesn't add up to the number of days. It's what you can't pick it based on a date in a year. You have to have again do math in order to find it out because it's not corresponding. So,
John, just some
yes.
comments from the online participants, like Tiana Smith, sharing that this one of the reasons that they didn't change those names in all of the months all across Europe was, probably in an effort. Sorry, I lost a comment. To seek balance, to encourage pagans to convert to Christianity. Have you heard of that?
So I would say that's interesting speculation, but I don't think that it's retained to encourage or convert the pagans, because they were not all about. I would say that by the time they were thinking in those terms, at that point the Christian Roman Empire was not in a carrot mood. It was definitely in a stick mood. And so what the Christians were doing at that time to encourage the pagans is burn down their temples and chop down their druid trees and tell them, and close down their schools and burn their books. And so I don't think that they were really necessarily doing this as as a friendly persuasion kind of thing. I just think it's a thing that all the scientific treatises that they already had that. All the calendars already were called that. Everybody's already familiar with the system, and it was too much work to try to change it. Nobody maybe even thought of changing it. In so many ways, part of the idea of this lecture is just to kind of open up the lid on our calendrical inheritance. I mean, we have all of these weird things in our calendar, and it's always, you go to the microwave and you try to figure out the number of seconds, and you're reminded that there's only 60 in the numbers, right? So it goes 2.00, and that normally would mean 200. But in our particular system in our calendar, it means 160, right? So 2.00 because of the fact that 120, because there's two 60s as opposed to two hundreds in that, make that up. If we were, when I was a teenager, I tried to think of a whole bunch of ways to how could, we were trying to adopt the metric system and failed in the United States. And I was always trying to think, how could we make decimal time? So we could make it so that there is just 10 kind of long hours in a day, and those hours would be made up of 100, sort of longer minutes, which would then be made up of 100 seconds that are about the same size as our second or something like that. And then but then what do you do past that? And so I said, well, maybe we just give up the solar year and we have decimal years that are 100 days long. But you can imagine how people would be ready to adopt that. So instead we have this system where, again, it's hard to kind of have to remember how our microwaves work, or actually as we try to type things in, it'll fix it for us probably. And so in that same exact way, I think when the Christian Roman Empire and the Christians from the Middle Ages are inheriting everything that went before them, they just didn't change it. In other words, there was just something that they didn't rethink it in the same way that we haven't rethought all of this inheritance. So how much of our worldview is inherited, shaped by these inherited ideas? How much are we taking, totally for granted without ever questioning, our conceptions of time that we've inherited? Here's a presentation of a timeline. Our calendar, you could say, is like a timeline where each week is continually following after the next. Each one of the weeks are not corresponding to, but they are set against months that are following one after the other, and the months are made up into years, and the years are following centuries, decades, millennia. As we've seen kind of with the Mayan calendar and many others, the original calendars were circles, and so we have the 7-day week, and it continually cycles, and it always goes back to where it starts on Sunday. The weeks then are set against a cycle of months where December follows January and so on. December is followed by January and so on. And so that also works kind of like how this Mayan calendar worked with its interlocking time cycles. So where our circle of days is happening within our circle of months, happening within the circle of years in a lifetime. So going to like one of my favorite medieval pictures here is showing the cycle of time, all the seasons, and is also showing how medieval people understood that the world is a sphere, unlike we sometimes have imagined, where they think it's flat. You can see here that they're on all sides of this planet as it's cycling through time. And then this is also an idea, a medieval picture of life cycle, another interesting and amazing kind of cosmic diagram. And so each one of these, as we go through, for the cycles of life, as far as medieval people saw them, they start with infancy, and it says here in Latin, I am gentle and humble, I live on pure milk. You can see it kind of going up around the circle. The next one is childhood. I shall never make a mistake, I measure my age, it says. To adolescence, looking at himself in the mirror, not the image in the mirror, but real life is joyful. Now he's in young adulthood. The guy's got a horse. He's got a falcon. He's showing off for the ladies. The next one, middle age. This is when you're at the top of the age cycle of life, as far as the medieval people are concerned. I am a king. I rule the world. The whole world is mine. This is like, and I'm reminded of The Simpsons when Lisa Simpson is sad that nobody listens to a little girl, and Marge is also grumpy that middle-aged women aren't listened to, and Homer's like, I'm a middle-aged man, everyone listens to me, white man, everyone listens to me. So he's king of the world at the middle of that. But then you're a senior, so he's already now walking with a staff. Now he needs a little boy to help him in old age. Now, as he's past old age, he's in infirmity, and finally, we have death and the funeral in this cycle. And for then the medieval people, this lived cycle is all connected and made whole through the timeless, or the eternal, oh, this is the grave, is the last one, and then starting again, through connecting to the timeless itself, which for them is God. So anyway, so at the center then, it is always you, because you are always through the different stages, you're still connected to the timeless. So anyway, as we're thinking about this life cycle of individual, a circle, within that we have our communities, that we're living in a much bigger circle as we're thinking about the different institutions in which we participate, like this one here. And those institutions and communities are within that much broader circle of human civilization. And that is my take on ancient calendars. Are there questions about how? Yes. Yes, 1 second. Wait for the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I get my microphone.
Yes.
Yeah. My question is, you've been talking for almost 1.5 hours, right?
This talk was about 1.5 hours?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I said, how would you, the Middle Ages, what do you call the Middle Ages? Is it from the year?
So it's hard to decide the decision of what to say. The Middle Ages was often from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 400s until the discovery of America by Columbus of 1492. So something like 500 to 1500 or something.
Oh, 500 to 15, I get it. So from 500 when the Roman Empire fell,
yes,
around the year 400 and something, I heard, and I read this many times, that civilization lost touch with technology and everything. I mean, they had to start all over again.
Yes.
So the word turned primitive, especially in Europe, turned primitive, so people have to begin all over how to read, how to everything. Why would that be after the Roman Empire fell?
So that's largely a myth. So in fact, the literacy was retained.
Yeah.
Almost all science, learning, almost every, even engineering is almost all retained. The main thing that collapses with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there is a vast loss of population. So the population collapses and goes down. There is a loss of a lot of the economic development. So the economy and trade go down. But in general, there's less capacity. There's no big state that can do these mass projects with lots of slaves and can build like a big aqueduct or something. But that doesn't mean that the technology level has gone down. It's just the human capacity to build stuff has gone down. And so, in fact, actually, there's continual increase in most technological advances through that period that's sometimes called the Dark Ages. So one of the things that spreads to Western Europe is the heavy plow. And so by the Central Middle Ages, there is a much more advanced plowing technology that allows Northern Europe to be much more populated than it was ever possible under the Roman times. There's continual advance in military technology. So the medieval knights are much higher level of military technology than the Romans, castles, all that kind of thing. Yeah,
that's the part I don't understand. They didn't quite understand how could they possibly lost that way. Because the Romans have everything. They have even buildings, like 4 stories, 5, 6 stories high. They had buildings like they had the tunnels, everything. I mean, suddenly after the Roman Empire fell, everything went down and people lost. Nope. It's like back to school again, you know? It's a myth that they didn't lose it all. Yeah. There's in Italy, for example, there's something like a 75% continuity with all of the Roman cities. So the Roman cities continued to exist. Those are the same cities in the Middle Ages. They're the same cities today in Italy. There's a handful of examples where a big Roman city got totally destroyed, and there's a couple new cities like Venice. But generally speaking, they're all the same. So there's total continuity. Okay, that's all. Thank you so much. Yeah. Valerie has a question.
Yeah, perhaps you did this earlier in the lecture, but I'll ask it anyway.
Sure.
So the idea of like eras related to the period of a ruler's reign.
Yes.
I understand that in Roman times that era that there were not calendars so much, but yearly reigns, and where these periods were named after the rule of emperors. Apparently, in Japan too, they do that, like the Meiji era or whatever. Yeah. And so they measure their calendar, their yearly, their periods of, let's say, it's the way we measure BC and AD. Right. Anyway, apparently, Roman rulers. Let's say, altered certain periods that were supposed to be set periods for their advantage, so that because a reign was supposed to be tied to a certain length of time, but they would actually inflate it, let's say, for their own advantage. And I'm just wondering about that. You know, is that something that that we know much about? Yeah, absolutely. So that is one thing that I didn't get to because it was already going long. but one of the things, exactly as you mentioned, when we do in our Western calendar, the Gregorian calendar is done AD, right? So we are technically counting like the number of years since the birth of Christ. But they've only been doing that since about the 700s. So that doesn't go all the way back. So the Venerable Bede is a major proponent that got us onto that system. And in fact, actually, even after that, in the West, in England, for example, it was quite common to simply say in the 7th year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and just start that way and never say what AD year it was, right? In terms of, and so, for example, the other calendars have systems like that. We mentioned the Islamic system is AH, Anno Hijri, which is to say dating from that exile to Medina. And then in the Jewish one, it's I think it's Anno Mundi. So it's the year technically counting since creation, but again, that's only been used as a system since the Middle Ages. So Maimonides had that. Before that, they would often date, for example, from the destruction of the temple, and so that would have been how that calendar would have worked before. So the Romans, we often hear a dating system called ab urbe condita, which is to say AUC, and that means since the founding of the city.
and that is popularized by the Roman historian Livy, but the Romans almost never used it. So to your point, what the Romans actually did was their highest civic magistrates were the consuls in the Roman Republic, and there were always 2 consuls. And so in order to list a year, you wouldn't say it was the year 73 or something like that. You would say in the year when Pompey and Crassus were consuls. And so then they'd always call it as the year when Pompey and Crassus were consuls. And so to your point about chicanery, if you were the consul, your term of office, in the Roman Republic is up when the year is up. But you also potentially could be working with the censor that's in charge of, and the priests that are in charge of adding intercalendary days. And so if you add days to your year, you could get an extra month out of it or something like that. So that's certainly possible. And so that kind of chicanery is one of the things that Caesar put a stop to when he fixed the calendar. So there's no more, after Julius Caesar, there's no more intercalation other than it's by a system. The same thing gets true for all the calendars. So all the way back into the Jewish calendar, there was a whole bunch of time period when the different priests and then later the rabbis are having to make observations in Syria, Palestine, and Judea about certain things like crops happening or something like that, and that's when they decide that the intercalation happens. Now they just do it by a mathematical formula. So essentially, over time, the things all get fixed as opposed to they're kind of loosey-goosey in the earlier times. Yeah.
There would be implications for birthdays. Some people would be shortchanged. No?
Yes. So it would be complicated. We have this thing that still happens in the West. If you end up getting born on February 29th, you only have so many birthdays. You have like 1/4 the number of birthdays of all the rest of us, right? But it would have been like that in antiquity if you were born in that whole intercalation period of time, or if you are born in one of those leap months that the Jewish calendar has, or any other one of these calendars. But people largely didn't mark birthdays. So birthdays become a big deal for us, but there's all kinds of places where, for example, in Eastern Europe, it's your Christian day, so you'll be like named for a saint. And so whatever that saint's day will be your kind of main day where you have your annual party or something like that. And other kinds of days might have been marked previously. They were less, it's a much more recent thing. And so in fact, actually, that's why one of the reasons why historians often, for somebody who's not particularly important, or even in some cases where they are important because kids aren't important, we don't actually even know the year that a person was born. Much less when they were born, because they're not paying as much of attention to it. But some cultures do mark birthdays. But anyway, so they might not have cared as much about what the birthday was.
Just one question that came from some of the folks that were in the meditation hour here is there a connection between the Mayan calendar and the Gregorian reform that you're aware of? As Europeans had become increasingly aware that they had to reform their calendar, and
right.
Yet they encountered in the early 1600s this calendar that was a lot more precise than the one they had.
Right.
Did they use any of this new knowledge that they found in the Mayan calendar?
No, I don't think they did at all. So in fact, they were. The Europeans were amazingly, I think we can say for sure they didn't. So the Europeans were amazingly wasteful and contemptuous of Mesoamerican civilization. So the Europeans appropriated all of the domesticated plants. So almost all of our best plants and everything like that came from Mesoamerican and science that had cultivated all of those kind of things. But things like all of their texts and astronomy and everything like that, they largely burned. And then there's only a couple survivors, and it was only for the Mayan stuff. it's only in the later 20th century that they actually cracked the Mayan code, and we could actually start to read Mayan and understand what the calendar was all like. And so I would say instead that the Gregorian calendar is corresponding to, that reform is corresponding to the rise of modern astronomy. So as we now starting to have this, much more advanced astronomy, with Tycho Brahe and later Galileo and everything like that, as that same emerging awareness of astronomy is happening, realization of how off the calendar is also starting to be serious. And so the Pope, commissions, people don't think of this, but the papacy in the early modern times in the Renaissance is a great patron of the sciences. And so they commission a council to try to fix the calendar, and then essentially they do, and they fix it for all of the Catholic territories. But then all the Protestants are like, we hate the popes, we hate the Catholics, and so they've held out for a lot longer. And so they held their nose for a couple hundred years, and so then they had ultimately everybody kind of agreed, and they fixed it, and we went over to the Gregorian calendar, except for the Eastern Europeans, and everybody's ultimately adopted the Western calendar, even if people maintain for their own liturgical use, to figure out when the Chinese New Year is, to figure out when Ramadan is, to figure out when Orthodox Christmas is. Everybody has those calendars, but they're not the calendar that they use in their daily lives. All right, well, okay, we'll finish. Thanks.